Hi, this is Debbie from CorpU, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Lead Effectively by Making Better Decisions, with our featured panelist, John Austin. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Should you have any issues during the webinar, please use the question box and I will assist you. Today's event will be recorded and shared at the end of the webinar. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Alan from CorpU to get us started. Alan?
All right. Thank you, Debbie. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited about having John Austin with us today. John has been studying critical thinking, decision-making, scenario planning as an expert, teaching at top business schools around the world, consulting with leading companies. And so we've got some great things to talk about. And I know John's just a fantastic presenter and fantastic CorpU faculty in our critical thinking and decision-making course. So if we think about how or why decision-making, why is this topic important? So I was thinking about that this morning and looking at the headlines. So I don't know if you've been following what's been going on in France, but I'll use that as just as an example. A couple of weeks ago, the yellow vest protesters. So in France, people get yellow vests, and you're required to put it on if your car breaks down. So the yellow vest protesters, as they're known, about 10,000 people got fed up with a gas tax, and they protested. And so a couple of weeks ago, I can only imagine that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, thought about and watched the protesters and sat with his team and made a decision. And the decision he made is that we're going to do nothing and we're going to let this pass. And that's maybe 4 weeks ago. Then you go 3 weeks ago. So a week later, instead of 10,000, there's 50,000 or tens of thousands of people. 2 weeks later, you're pushing 100,000 people and getting to hundreds of thousands of people. And then you get to this weekend. It's a beautiful December day, the most important shopping season of the year in Paris. And this weekend, the stores are boarded. The protesters are prying cobblestones out of the Champs-Élysées and throwing them at police. The streets are burning. There are military tanks patrolling the streets. And then I wake up this morning and look at today's New York Times, and I see that the president of France has made another decision. So each week he huddles with the team. They look at the calculus, their odds. They have to make a decision. Do we do something? Do we do nothing? And lo and behold, this morning's paper, we're going to do something. And so they've made a decision. The same thing I noticed with Theresa May's leadership in the United Kingdom. She continues to make the decision to double down on Brexit. So I thought it was fascinating to watch and think about how important decisions are made all the time. And so you might imagine, what was it like to be a GE board member? So GE in the Dow Jones was the worst performer of 2017. GE was the worst performer of 2018. They've lost $140 billion in market value. And in June of this year, they had the dubious distinction of becoming the last 19th century Dow member to be removed from the Dow. So the torch has passed to the 21st century. GE's gone, but by September, they fired their CEO, John Flannery. He'd only been there barely over a year. So imagine the decision making and the way they must frame. They just put a new CEO in, and they made a decision for the first time in the company's history, one, to fire a CEO within a year, and number two, for the first time in the company's history, to replace him with somebody that doesn't work at GE, doesn't know the culture, the company, the vision, the strategy. They went with somebody completely different. These are huge decisions that are made, and we all make decisions every day. It's no different than if a child is begging for ice cream. We're making decisions, yes or no. What's the calculus of the outcome? Can I get them to do something that is good for them or good for me? And so we're all forced to make decisions and think about that every day. Whether you're a political leader, a business leader, a family leader, you need to learn ways to analyze issues in order to form a judgment. And we know that this is a really important topic because there are many, many surveys. I'm showing just a simple one here that shows that critical thinking blows away collaboration or creativity, innovation, in the top most important skills. So critical thinking, number one. So you ask yourself, well, how good are we at it? And I found this one to be pretty fascinating. So you look at large managers and executives, 98% say they fail to apply best practices when making decisions, even though they know that's 95% correlated with financial performance. So decision effectiveness matters. It's a big deal. And job postings continue to increase. And among employees with 4-year college education, only 28% were rated as excellent. So a supermajority of college-educated people do not rate themselves as excellent critical thinkers. So let's do a quick poll. Okay, everybody, get your warm up your keyboard fingers, and let's hit with the first poll and see just 2 quick questions about critical thinking. So the first one, real simple. How important is critical thinking in your organization? So start clicking away. We'll give you 30 seconds. Made it real simple. How are we doing? Get the answer? All right. So only 2% felt not important, but obviously a very large supermajority, very important. So it's very important. So let's fill that. Let's do the next poll real quick and just ask, so given that we think it's important, how effective is your organization at making decisions? So let's get those polls going. 10 seconds in, we'll give it 10 more seconds or so. All right, we're good? Yep. So let's show it, and I'll just use these. I just wanted to use these to tee up John, because John is an expert in decision making. So John, what our gang told us today is that this is it's super important, but only 15% feel that their organization is very effective at decision making. So the other 85% somewhat effective, which is good. Good to see, and then not effective at 11%. So we'll close down those polls, and let's take this back, and I'd like to turn it over to John Austin to walk through a little bit about how we all might make better decisions, and then after John walks us through that, so this will be 20 minutes or so, we're going to come back and take questions. So please, while John's going, type your questions into the question box, and keep your typing fingers happy. So we'll make this interactive for the second half. Without further ado, I turn it over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you all for joining us here. And absolutely, I'd love to, any questions, any comments, feel free to jump into to that question box. So I have the luxury of thinking about decision making a lot in my work, and the responses that you all gave here certainly sound pretty familiar with what I hear. That is that, yeah, of course, critical thinking and decision making is very important. Of course, we all know that, and generally speaking, we think our organizations are competent at it. And our challenge as leaders is how can we get beyond just competence at it. And the conversation I'd like to have with you over the next 30 minutes or so is really about how can we really understand how experienced decision makers can be more effective. So the focus here is not on sort of introduction to decision making. It's really what are the traps that we fall into? What are the habits that we have that we need to be aware of as experienced decision makers? And when I think of decision making, I connect it directly to critical thinking. And for me, critical thinking is being active and in the way that you're evaluating information in front of you. And that's an easy thing to say, but our challenge is that we don't spend an awful lot of time thinking about how we think. And that's really what you have to do to improve your critical thinking. And to start that off, the way I think about this is realizing that you have a habit for how you make a decision, and you've developed that habit over many years. You're not going to be able to change that habit just by reading a new book or sitting in a webinar. You actually have to commit to some small action that would override one of your long-term habits. And so today, I'm going to offer you, as part of this, 3 small actions and 2 techniques that are designed to sort of change the way that we build our habits in our decision making. And to start that off, I have a path of least resistance that I often think about when it comes to how we let me just sort of shift through here. A path of least resistance that we always have to watch out for as leaders. And this is the cognitive path of least resistance that we fall into because most of the time we've been right in the past when we've made our decisions. This cycle is that we start with an initial assumption of the situation. It is often what I would refer to as a limited mindset. And what that means really is that we haven't really considered as broadly as we could the different things that are happening, different perspectives, different data than we're using, questioning various things about what is actually in front of us. Once we have that hypothesis, though, we then look for evidence we're right. That's the confirmation bias. And the beauty of all this is that we will find evidence we're right because we're really good at doing that. Even if the data suggests we're wrong, we have this amazing ability as humans to discount data that does not support what we think it ought to be. And this, of course, then feeds overconfidence. You notice that this cycle, I have it as a spiral that gets smaller here. And the reason for that is that we tend to cycle through this, and every time we do it, we look at more information. We become more confident that we're correct, and yet we don't realize that every time you go through the cycle, you look at a smaller subset of information. You start to look in fewer places for validation. I'll give you a quick example of this, and I want all of you to think for a moment. You don't know me, but I can tell you I'm not a very large person. I'm about maybe 5'8". I weigh about 140 pounds. And with that information, I want you to guess what sport I played when I was in college. I was on a college sports team. So everyone think to yourself what sport you think I played, all right? You have that in your mind. Now think about how you came to that decision of what sport I played. For most of you, what it is you don't know much about me. You just ran me through a filter in your mind of what athletes look like. And with that, you made a guess. What sport did I play? Most of the guesses are things like cross country, soccer, maybe, tennis, those types of things. And you can think about how you made that guess. Now, that's something we do every day, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's how we process information. You have to use your experience to do that. Where it gets interesting, though, is if I gave you 10 minutes to think about your guess, you would be more confident that you are correct, even though I gave you no more information about myself. In studies where people have been randomly assigned their answers, when they've been given 10 minutes to think about their answers, they argue far more passionately for those answers. And that's an illustration of this cycle. Is once you have an initial hypothesis, you want to win, you want to be right. And so you look for evidence you're right, and you sort of work through that. I wanted to introduce the conversation with this little model, because what I'd like to do now is walk us through it a little bit, mostly focusing on how we can break out of our initial definitions of our decisions. My belief is that for many of our leaders, the biggest challenge is training yourself to define your problem correctly and to break out of limited mindsets. Once you train yourself to do that, it starts to become easier to look for evidence you're wrong as well. And that starts to break the confirmation bias. So for me, that's where I like to break into this cycle. So with that, I always forget to tell people what sport I played, and that bothers people, no doubt. So I was a wrestler, and that's why I like to use this example. Very few people guess wrestling, but you remember you wrestle by weight class, so that kind of makes sense that we come in all sizes. Okay, so to move this story forward, though, here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to show you 3 playing cards out on the screen, and I want you to guess what the playing cards are, okay? It's just going to be on the screen for just a second or so. So take a look at it, and then it'll disappear, okay? All right. Okay, like I said, just on there for a second. Now I want you to think about what those 3 cards were. All right, and now what many people will see on this, the third card, it was do you remember what it was? It's a 10 of diamonds. The second card, that was a king of clubs. The first card, what did you think that was? When we've done this, about 80% of the time, people see that as a jack of heart. Is that what you saw in that first card? Was that a jack of heart? Now, approximately 15% of the people see that as something else. Let's take a look at what those cards were. So that first card is a jack of red spade. How many of you admit to yourself, did you see that as a jack of a red spade? If you saw it as a jack of red spade, did you get through all 3 cards? For most people, if they do see that as a jack of red spade, they don't get through all 3 cards because it slowed them down. I use this as an example. First of all, I want to be clear. I didn't trick you on this. You tricked yourself because you know what playing cards look like. You didn't have a lot of time. You saw it was red. You moved through, and you just guessed it was a heart, and you moved on. It's not a heart. It's a red spade. You know that this card does not exist based on your experience. If you did see that it was something odd, it slowed you down. You didn't get through all 3 cards, all right? Now, this is just a real simple illustration. This actually goes back to Kuhn's book on scientific revolution, this particular example. It actually is just an illustration of how we train ourselves to see based on our experience. And that's the only point I want to make off of this, is that the way you define your decision is so driven by your past experience that we don't often even know that it is. And that's the thing that I would like to focus us on just a little bit. And to move forward with this, I want to share with you this other image. This is I purposely chose an image that I was guessing that many of you have seen before. This is the image of the young woman and the old woman. It has been in pretty much every social psychology textbook, introductory textbook, since the 1930s, and that's not really an exaggeration. This is the original image. Many of you have probably seen the line drawing, which is easier to produce. This is the original image from an 1870s German postcard. Even though many of you have seen this image before, when I first flashed the image up on this screen, all of you saw it as either a young woman or an old woman. And the only reason you looked for the other one is because you know it's there. And that's something that we also need to think about, is that unless you train yourself to look for a different way to see your decision, you will not naturally do that. It's the first attempt that's hard to do that. Now, notice, for those of you who have seen this now as a young woman and an old woman, it is, and you can kind of keep staring at this a little bit if you're still trying to see both of those images. I'll give you a task for later in the day to keep going back and looking at this image if you're struggling with this. But for those of you who have now seen both the pictures, the young woman and the old woman, look at how easy it is to now flip back and forth. It takes virtually no cognitive effort to flip between the young woman and the old woman. And that's the image I like to have when we're making decisions. The cognitive effort that we need to go into is forcing ourselves to develop the habit of asking, what's a different way to define the decision? Once you've done that at the beginning of a decision process, it's really easy to switch back and forth. It takes no effort, and throughout the rest of the process, you can use both those perspectives. So with that leads me to my first small action, and it's a real obvious one. And that is question convention. And the small action here is train yourself whenever a new decision comes to your desk. Ask yourself how someone else would see that problem differently. And that someone else ought to be someone specific. Do you have a key stakeholder involved in this decision? Ask how they would define what the problem is, or how they would define the decision. If you have an internal systems problem, ask yourself how your customer would define that decision and see that as an issue. That might give you a different perspective. And then for the rest of that decision process, it's easy to flip between those perspectives. If any of you have teenagers at home, think about using this at home simply as another way to exercise this mental muscle. When you have a teenager who comes to you and asks you for something that seems kind of not rational, or in some way it's hard for you to figure out why it is they want to do what they want to do. ask how they're seeing this, and play with that a little bit. And that's another way that you can work with that. So, all right, so let's move this forward just a little bit here. Now, there are many sources, obviously, of limited decision frames. I'm going to focus on two common sources that experienced decision makers have that are blind spots to how they define their decisions. And these really have an effect on our ability to sort of be strategic in the choices we make. The first is ignoring the past, and the second is being blinded by current trends. And that might seem a little odd, but basically it's this idea that we focus too much on current trends. So for each one of these, what I'd like to do is actually give you a technique that I use to overcome these things. So ignoring the past, and let me tell you a little story about this. In 1928, well, first of all, you've heard of the phrase as easy as it's a, was it, now I'm blanking on my phrases here. It's as best thing since sliced bread, right? Well, actually, sliced bread was quite an innovation. In 1928, the first bread slicing machine was introduced. And here's why I want to talk about this. The overwhelming reaction to bakers at the time to this sliced bread machine was they thought it was absurd. They thought it was a very bad idea and that no one would want sliced bread. It led to a small incremental value and convenience for customers, but it greatly reduced the quality of the bread because the crust protects the bread. So virtually all bakers at the time refused to use these sliced bread machines. And I like this as an example because what ends up happening here is that demand quickly pushed aside their resistance to this. And eventually, every baker had to adopt a sliced bread machine because by 1930, which is when Wonder Bread introduced its national sliced bread, if you went into a baker, you expected to have the option to get your bread sliced. So in 1928, 90% of the bakers said this was a bad idea. By 1930, everyone was doing this. What I want to focus on here is the baker's initial suspicion. Every innovation has naysayers and every new idea will be criticized. But this is where it gets a little tricky. Most of the time, the naysayers are right. And it's so tempting to say innovators must ignore the critics. But you know, there's wisdom in listening and wisdom in fighting the urge to discount criticism because very often they're right. We all would like to say we would have been one of the bakers who knew that this was a really good idea. Statistically, that's absurd. Most of us would be the bakers that said this was never going to happen. And so how do we learn from the past when we believe that we wouldn't have made the same mistake? So that leads me to my second small action number 2. Start with the assumption that you would make the same mistakes as others. You're never going to learn from past decisions that your organization has made if you believe that if only you were there, the organization would not have made that decision. So how do we do this? Well, let me share with you one quick technique that can work with this. And it's a simple thing that I've been using with some groups that I've been working with. And it's called the backward forward flip. And this is really a simple exercise you can use with any decision team that you're working with. And essentially what it is you start by, if you have a current decision in front of you, you think back, say 5 years, maybe you go farther back, or maybe only 3 years back in your industry, and you try to identify a similar type of decision that was made in the past where conventional wisdom was wrong. And then you ask, well, why did everyone say that this would not work? It wouldn't happen. Why were they wrong? And then all really we want to do is, after we've had that conversation about a past event, we then come back to our current event and we ask the same question. Why do people say that it will not happen? And why might people be wrong? And basically what this does is it trains you to look beyond the obvious choice, which is conventional wisdom. And it's a great little exercise to get you to start thinking about how we can make sure that we are actually learning from those pasts in various ways. Now, like a quick example that I use in my book about this is you can play with the idea of what book selling. So going way back, go back to the founding of Amazon as a company. If you remember that moment, most booksellers did not necessarily see a threat from online book sales. And part of that was because Barnes & Noble had just fairly successfully redesigned or retranslated people's views of what the experience of buying a book would be. And it was almost the opposite of online book buying. It made it experience. You went into the Barnes & Noble store and there was places to sit, you could browse, you could discover things. All of these things that made it feel like there was no way people would buy books without being right there and being able to pick them up and feel them. You can play with that a lot and start to realize all of the reasons why they did not anticipate the rapid adoption of online book buying. Now take that to the current moment, and you could think about different things about current book purchases and ask the same question. For example, do we expect that the trend towards digital books is going to continue, or will there be a move back towards hard copy books? These are different types of questions that you can ask that have a conventional response right now. So with that, that's a really kind of quick and simple technique that you can work with that will allow you to keep this. I'm blanking here for a moment here, but sort of keep yourself from allowing your assumption about the past to limit your mindset about the future or about the present right now. Now, I want to shift though a little bit though, because that was just one. Another one is trends. And so let me talk for a moment about trends, and then I'll give you another small action, another technique that I like to use, and then we'll stop there and we'll take some questions around that. Here, I moved off of my slide, so let me move back here. This is a very well-known chart that's been around for a number of years. And some of you are going to see this as something somewhat familiar. This is a chart that was crafted to talk about sort of what happened during the internet bubble and sort of the investing story for both venture capital, for company founding, and also obviously for just simple investing. And I love this partially just as a way to think about how we get so caught up in the idea that trends are what they are, and that's what they will always be, that we're at the beginning of a long-term trend. We always seem to believe that we're at the beginning of a long-term trend. This particular chart has reappeared quite suddenly in a lot of people, mostly because of conversations about cryptocurrencies right now. And I find it interesting that this chart now is making sort of a second round as people are trying to deal with what's going on in the cryptocurrency area. Now, the thing about this that I think we need to kind of struggle with is it's really, really hard to predict the end of a trend. In fact, I think if our job is trying to predict the end of a trend, we will most likely fail. But instead, what we could start doing is thinking about how do you anticipate shifts rather than try to predict shifts. What are the weak signals that could suggest that there is that we're about to shift something? And because we tend to think that whatever is the current trend is going to continue on indefinitely, and we would never say it that way, but it sort of underlies the assumptions about our choices, then that becomes a key blind spot that limits the way that we work with information here. So one way to think about why that happens is because you have data on a current trend. What that also means is that you have evidence to support your decision if you base a decision on a current trend. It means it's easy to defend your decision. It's very hard to defend a decision which is about anticipating a shift in a trend. That's a lot more challenging, and it takes a lot more effort to do that. So how do we deal with this? Well, one of the things that we find that is useful as a way to deal with this is to think about the data that we have and look for evidence that the data that we have might actually have some weaknesses. And that actually leads me to small action number 3, which is think about how you make decisions in your work organization and think about the data that you use to make those decisions. How often do you ask yourself is it the right data to make your decisions? And that's actually the small action that I would encourage you to take. This is the habit that I think is the most important habit for us to develop as leaders as it relates to our use of information and data. When new information comes to you, when a new decision comes to you, very often what happens is that a big pile of data comes to you as well with the communication. This is what we know about this decision. Make a choice. That leads us to think, oh, if I swim through this data, I will get an answer to this decision. And that's not usually the case, particularly as you move through your career and you advance in your career. It is not going to be the case that the data that comes to you with your new decisions is going to have the answer in it, because someone else would have already found that answer. You only get the decisions that do not have answers in the current data. And we don't announce that this is where you're at in your career. It's now time for you to start going beyond the data that's given to you. And think about how that transition from looking at the data for an answer to asking yourself what is the right data to answer this question before you look at the data involves a change in habit. Most of our educational lives, we are trained to get the answers from the data that was given to us. That's how you solve the math problems. At a certain point in your career, that shifts, and we don't tell you that you are now making this shift. So the action that we find works is when next time a new decision comes to you, ignore all of the data that comes with that decision. And instead, ask yourself what's the ideal information you would like to have to answer that question and make that decision. Doesn't matter whether that data is available, just ask and answer that question. Once you have an answer to that question, then you look at your data and it will jump out at you what's missing from that data. So this is to me the small action that I really would love more of our decision makers to adopt. As we get into big data, as we get into this sort of awash in data that many of our organizations have, we haven't solved this problem, we've made it worse. Because we have more data to swim through, makes it more likely that with the confirmation bias can allow us to find the answers that we want within those data sets. One final thing I would say about this particular action, though, is that if you have something like a dashboard that's updated daily that your entire organization works from, that is another place that we have to be very vigilant as leaders. The dashboard creates an assumption that the information that we're getting is good information. And so every once in a while, we have to make sure that we are revisiting the design of our dashboard so the right data is coming to us and that the data collection underlying that dashboard is still aligned with our current strategies. So remembering that a dashboard is a snapshot, but we live in a fluid world is a good way to remind yourself your dashboard is always a little dated with that in terms of what it's telling you and also when the data was collected. Okay, so I promised you 2 techniques. I only told you 1. So I'm going to close this out with a second technique. And then what I'd love to do is allow you to start thinking about any questions you might have or thoughts you have about decision-making, critical thinking. The intent of this was really to focus in on really one part of the decision process. And for me, it's all about how we define our decisions that I think is the critical place that we can greatly advance our ability to make good decisions, which is why I wanted to spend this webinar on this part of it. The one little exercise I wanted to share with you is something called uncertainty vectoring, and it's an offshoot of what is called scenario planning, which some of you might be aware of. And the reason I want to share this with you is that this is a technique that does a great job of counteracting our tendency to focus on trends. If you're familiar with scenario planning, it tends to focus on those things that we don't really have data about, that we're uncertain about. And looking at uncertainties is just a way to offset our bias towards trends when we make our decisions. Obviously, in a good decision process, you focus on trends and uncertainties. My aim is to find a technique that counteracts the over-reliance on trends. I'm not here to say that we ignore our trends, all right? So the way this works is that any type of technique that focuses on looking at uncertainties, you start with a question of what are the top uncertainties. And usually what we would do is we would reach out to experts and then just ask them that question. What are the key uncertainties that we need to know about? And the key thing here is it's garbage in, garbage out. So you don't want to generate a list of key forces, trends, and uncertainties that we're just making up out of our minds. We want to find the experts in our organization, in our industry, and perhaps even outside of our industry, and ask this question of them. And what you're looking at here is an example that came from, this was actually an exercise around an organization that was deciding whether or not they were going to expand the sort of creating bars in college towns. So basically, and so that's what this is. Is there going to be a growth in demand for bars in a college town? And they identified these 10 uncertainties that they had about this particular college town. And you can sort of read through those and see, it has to do with basically, are there going to be long-term trends in alcohol consumption, socializing, entertaining, competition? How about things about the state allocation of liquor licenses? How many young professionals are going to be moving to the area? Demographic changes, all of those types of things came out here. Now, what we do is we just actually pick one of these, and you see where those X's are on that image. Each one of those X's illustrates on this particular uncertainty, where are we today? So if you're going to look, let's say, 10 years out, uncertainty number 1, change in alcohol consumption. What this is saying is that we have no idea over the next 10 years whether it is more, alcohol consumption is more likely to go down or more likely to go up. And so the X is right in the middle. The ability to find staff is an example here on uncertainty 5, where is it going to become harder or easier to find staff going forward? For this particular exercise, the belief is that it was going to become a lot easier to find staff going forward. So in that case, most of the uncertainty is directional. It is going towards one direction and not the other. So with that, that exercise of going through and marking not only what are the uncertainties, but in which direction is most of the uncertainty over the next 10 years, in this case, leads us to this. All right, so off of this exercise then, we took that first uncertainty and we said, all right, we're gonna go with alcohol consumption. And then I'm gonna not go into too much detail here, but essentially what we then do is that we look at all of the other uncertainties on our list, and we find uncertainties that we think are highly correlated with this, and that we align these on a chart, essentially. And we try to align them such that the uncertainties go to, are in the direction of their correlation. And we line up all of our X's. So like I said, I'm not trying to make you an expert on this as much as to give you a little bit of an example here. And so we start to build out a map based on these uncertainties here. And sometimes we find an uncertainty that is important, but not at all correlated with the others. And that might become our perpendicular uncertainty here. Now, after filling this out, what we start to get is an image, which is an image of how all of these different uncertainties fall together. And what's the point of doing this? Well, by doing this, what we're actually doing is creating potential snapshots of the future that allow us to think about, well, all right, if this uncertainty moves in one direction, what is likely to happen to all of the other uncertainties? And by doing that, you start to create multiple non-conventional images of the future. And so this little image here is all of the possible futures that we've created out there. What this has now done is created us a way to think about the future that is based on uncertainties rather than based on trends. We can start asking our questions. these areas out on our image, which are outside of that circle, are they possible? Are they realistic? Or are they aspects of the future that we would say they simply would never happen here? The other thing this allows us to do is say, well, what if we know what's going to happen to one of these uncertainties? We can now use that to start to potentially answer in a very rudimentary way some ways of thinking about what happens with all of those other uncertainties. And so it gives us a way to start to predict, or I shouldn't say predict, that's a bad word in this case, but to, excuse me, to actually play a little bit with the interactions of uncertainties. What this is a technique that is biased towards uncertainties and away from trends. If we can take this technique and lay it over a technique that is biased towards trends, which is most of our forecasting tools, we might actually get some insight that could broaden our perspective. We also can start to ask questions about what are some things that we don't know? What is data that we need? Well, maybe there's an uncertainty that we have no information about, and this could give us one way that we could start thinking through that. And you can imagine playing off of this with a lot of different uncertainties. So why do I want to talk about this? Well, and this is actually what I'm going to do here is close it out and invite some questions here. But the idea here is essentially that if you remember that initial chart, the cycle of limited mindset leading to confirmation bias, leading to overconfidence. All I wanted to talk about here is a few different ways for us to think about getting small actions to get you to break out of that cycle, to even see that that cycle happens in the first place, to help people that work with you break out of that cycle. And then secondly, recognize that any time we bring in techniques to help us with our decision process, I want you to ask yourself, does it help us break out of this cycle? And that's what I believe these two techniques can help us do. With that, I'm going to open this up to questions. I'll hand it back to Alan as well. Yes, so we can go from there.
All right, John. Thank you for that presentation. We have questions coming in. Please get your questions into the question box. The first question up from Mary is regarding 2019 planning. Since we're coming up on a new year, do you have any advice for us to run better planning meetings using scenario planning?
Yeah, I do actually, and there's actually a few ways to think about that. One is you could do a large-scale scenario planning process, which involves often, bringing a lot of people together, and it's useful to do that before you're in your planning cycle, as a way to sort of get people to think more broadly about this. If you are already deep into your cycle, one small technique you can do to add scenario planning into it is to spend a little bit of time with your team and identify, what are the 10 key forces that you're going to be dealing with over the next 3 to 4 years as an organization. And then ask yourself, what's the data that you have to understand what direction it's going in? And basically, if you just create a list of 10 key uncertainties and trends, you can then, as you do your planning, you can keep referring back to that list to see whether or not the plans that you are creating address those uncertainties and trends. So that's kind of a short way that you can bring this in. A larger way, like I said, is to actually bring a group of your team together a few months before the next planning cycle and spend a day talking about scenarios, uncertainties, and those types of things.
All right, great. Next up from Dave. I often become frustrated working with senior leaders who think they know the answers to complex issues via gut and experience. What advice do you have to help open up decision makers to new data, information, and better decision processes?
So I use a technique which is about, it starts with the idea of working together with someone with an unknown. So oftentimes what you're talking about is there's people that all of us struggle with this at sometimes, that we think we already know what the answer is, and we're going to reject the data. That's that moving towards the confirmation bias part of that cycle. If you approach someone like that with something that you can both agree that we don't know the answer to, and say, hey, so there's an expectation that this customer base over here is likely going to adopt this new technology within the next 2 years, but we don't actually have information about that, about the speed of adoption. So what type of experiment could you and I generate together that would allow us to answer that question? And if you frame something along, let's work together to create an experiment to answer something, you appeal to that person's belief that they know how to figure things out. And so it's one way that you can basically get them aligned with you, that there's stuff that we need to know. And then together, you get that person to agree with you. What's the data that would prove our hypothesis? If you start the conversation with that, rather than going to them with the data that you've already collected to answer that question, you actually get buy-in from them first on what's the data needed, and then it becomes sort of their project as well. So that's kind of a little tactic that I've used. You basically invite them to be your partner. And I appreciate that might not work in your situation, and that's kind of the quickest thing I can say here, though.
Well, let's build on that. We have a question from Roberto. Imagine you have identified a new scenario and you want to move your organization there, but it's hard to believe you. How can you lead this situation? What advice do you have?
Yeah. So there's a couple things here. Wow, yeah. So one of the things that we know is that stories that align with your audience are one of the more powerful ways to get people to move in a new direction. And the power of storytelling as a change leader is I think, sort of a core thing. So the first thing that I would think about with that is to really think about how can you translate that scenario into multiple stories that will align with multiple stakeholders. So it's sort of, what does it mean? How do you make it resonate with each of those individual people? And it cannot be the same story. The data that will persuade one group of people is going to be discounted by a second group of people. So how is it that you're going to translate your story across that? So yeah, it's probably not very satisfying, but ideally the best way is to get them involved in the process of building the scenarios in the first place. That's one of the most persuasive ways that you can get people to break out of conventional thinking, is to allow them to participate in the process of looking at alternative futures. The communication of alternative futures is often better if you share multiple alternative futures as well, because that makes it seem less like you're trying to persuade someone to see the way you see it, but as much as you're giving them sort of still a choice in different ways of seeing the futures.
Okay, we got a nice thank you from Roberto. So the next question up from Shelley is, how do we know about our own blind spots? So you talked about blind spots. How do we, if we have a blind spot, wouldn't it seem we wouldn't know it? So how do we know about our own blind spots?
Yeah, absolutely. Almost by definition, right? So there's actually a couple things I can suggest on this at the individual level. One is just, if you start with the assumption that you have them, that goes a long way. So one of the things that I find very powerful is realizing that we all build from our own experiences, and that we are biased in our perception of the world. And bias is sometimes it's got a very negative connotation, but essentially what that's saying is that our view of the world has been formed by our experiences and by our professional training, all of these types of things. And if you start with the assumption that you have some biases, that at least gets you to start looking for different perspectives. And to me, that's one of the most powerful things you can do, is just assume that other people see the world differently, and that doesn't mean that they're stupid. It just means that they actually have a different experience, and you can learn from that. The second very tactical thing, I encourage everyone to have a decision buddy. And that is a person who you trust and you like, who maybe once every couple weeks you have lunch with them, or you go out for drinks or something, and you both talk about the decisions that you're making. It might be easier for someone who works at the same company as you, so that you don't feel the need to sort of be careful about what you say. It shouldn't be someone that you work with day to day, though. And that person can potentially point out things that you're missing. And that's a great way for you to help each other with those blind spots.
Perfect. Makes perfect sense. So are there ways, this comes from Sue, are there ways to determine whether or not information about the changing environment is relevant to your organization or just noise that you should ignore? So you want to talk about signal to noise ratio?
Wow, yeah. So it probably won't surprise you based on my last one of my last answers here is that
right.
I think the first thing is you need to see it in the first place. And then the second thing is to debate its relevance and also the data that will give you some answers to that question. So if you generate a list of 10 high impact uncertainties, each one of those you can go through and actually debate does it matter for your organization? And obviously if the answer is no, we move on to a different uncertainty. The second is there data out there that would give us some insight into this? It is actually the creation of sort of experiments to collect data that often will help you answer that question.
Okay, so Jerry is asking, why do top business leaders make bad decisions? And so, I'm just adding in, you said Barnes and Noble earlier versus Amazon and Blockbuster. How is it that smart business leaders make bad decisions?
Because we're human.
Yeah. Right.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, but wow, that's such a big question, really. But it is that none of us are perfect, and that part of the problem here is that we think that if we put smart people together, they will counteract each other. And that's what we do in our organizations. And unfortunately, what very often happens is we reinforce each other. And so I think that's part of our challenge with this. We need to train ourselves to sort of look for what's missing. We also have to be prepared to be wrong and to react quickly to that. So and that actually is very hard because you commit to a specific strategy. It's really hard then to pivot away from that strategy. And sometimes we even have to replace our CEOs because they're so personally connected to the strategies. But think about that Barnes and Noble had just beaten Borders essentially strategically. They won. They were on top. So you almost feel like it's unfair for them to suddenly have to completely blow up the strategy that got them to number one. It almost doesn't seem right, but that's essentially what we have to do. And we have limited cognitive processing capacity as individuals, so we will be wrong quite often. The challenge is being able to see that you're wrong more rapidly rather than to be perfect, I guess. Right. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
No. I think that building on everything you've said, the one question that has been gnawing at me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts at this, and we may end up closing with this topic. But one thing I notice when I go into a problem-solving meeting, we'll get around the room, and within 5 minutes, we start jumping to solutions. So if we have an hour, this is just my personal experience, and it happens every single time. And I'm always trying to catch myself saying, you're jumping to a solution. You're jumping. We have to focus. And I'm always remembering Albert Einstein said something to the effect of, if you give me an hour to solve a problem or come up with a solution, I'll spend 59 minutes studying the problem and 1 minute on the solution. And I'm wondering, and I always think about that because I struggle with it, and I watch everyone struggle with it every meeting. Do you when you think about problem solving, how can we get people to spend 55 minutes on the problem and not 5 minutes and jump immediately to solutions? I see it every day.
Yeah, part of that is that a lot of our organizations, particularly in the U.S., are very much have adopted the decide and fix process of decision making, and I'm sort of diagnosing the problem here is that it's primarily because we are action oriented and it feels good to make the decision. It doesn't feel good to be indecisive. So all of these things lead to pressure to make a decision and then fix the decision after, and that is a decision process that people use. I think a big part of it is because there's pressure and tendency towards that we need to figure out ways to offset that with a decision process that we use. So having someone in your team who's assigned the job of asking questions about multiple perspectives might be one way to offset that tendency. Or also just as a leader to accept the idea that I'm not going to accept a choice unless I know that you're going to be bringing me multiple options that you have really debated and thought about. So you can sort of establish rules for other people as one way to change that process.
Yep. Okay. Got it. Thank you. And then we have one minute if you can. I think this is a good question coming in. It is very difficult to ignore the advice of experts. What's the best way to question their advice? Final question.
The best way to question an expert's advice, and this is my 30-second answer to that, is do not ask them for their answer. Instead, ask them to explain to you how they came up with their answer. This is something that you can do if your job is to take the expert's advice and move it forward, because what you can say to the expert is, hey, you're the expert. I'm going to have to explain and defend your answer, though. So help me understand how you got to it, just so that I can understand, I can explain it and justify it. And what you're basically doing is appealing to that expert's expertise, so it doesn't feel like you're second guessing them. But that does two things. It allows you to see the logic behind how they've made their choice, which gives you an ability to judge in some ways that expertise. The second thing is many experts will catch their own mistakes if you ask them to talk through their answer. So that's the tactic I always recommend with how to work with experts.
All right, John, thank you so much for your time today. Hopefully everybody learned a few things. You taught us a few techniques, some problem framing, scenario planning ideas. The slides will be available for people. So we had a lot of questions coming in. We had a lot of comments and people that want to use some of your frameworks and tools. So that was John Austin, and we teach a critical thinking and decision-making course led by John. It is an online 3-week course, and we have various 1-week versions of it for those that are interested. But thank you all. Hope everyone has a great holiday season, and we'll be back in January with more CorpU Open programs and CorpU webinars. Thank you again, John. Appreciate it. And thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your year and holiday season.
Thank you, everyone.